Thank you so much, Igor, and to the lecture committee for having me as your first in-person, back in-person lecture of the year, or of 2 years now. I wish we were having this lecture at Bronzeville Winery, which will hopefully open next month. And so next time you guys all come to Chicago, I will take you out for a drink or food there. So I also want to say Sunleen Phi Log and Happy Lunar New Year to those who celebrate. I'm really excited to share work and ideas with you today, and on this really kind of urgent and I think complicated theme of building identities that makes up this lecture series. So just to talk a little bit about framework, I'm going to share with you 6 projects that span across 3 categories: policy proposals, platforms, which is an approach to exhibition and editorial projects, which focuses on the work, amplifying the work of others, and professional practice. But I will start and end this lecture with 2 speculative design research projects, which also explore the intersection of professional practice and social equity. This topic, this kind of intersection between practice and equity, is something that I've been personally wrangling with over the course of my career at 3 different scales. So maybe this is like a little bit of an introduction to me for those of you who don't know me. As an individual, I think I've been reckoning with my own lived experience as a woman of color in the field of architecture. When I was growing up, my dad worked at a civil rights organization in San Francisco's Chinatown called Chinese for Affirmative Action, whose advocacy work included tenants' rights for recent immigrants, multilingual access to the census, as well as building solidarity between Asian, Black, and Brown communities. The image on the left there is Henry Durr, my dad's mentor, who was with Reverend Jesse Jackson advocating for the families of Vincent Chin after his murder in 1986. But I just share this with you to say that the relationship between my own identity, the built environment, and advocacy has been something that I've been growing up questioning and thinking about. Then I've also been thinking about this question as a historian. When I was a graduate student, I worked to try to understand how practice today has been constructed through law, habit, and institution. So I studied the emergence of corporate architecture practices in the US and the deregulation of the profession in the 1970s. And my research concentrated specifically on 2 areas. One, the way a series of antitrust lawsuits at the federal level banned fee schedules in the 1970s and transformed the discipline into a more self-interested field of competitors rather than of disinterested professionals. And second, the way that even practices which orient themselves around profit and growth, such as corporate architecture firms, continue to paradoxically create conditions to incubate an ecology of design, research, and development across the decades. This is Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill when they were located at Inland Steel. What I want to take away from, sorry, I'm getting like some kind of sound feedback here. I'm going to try to mute this here. Okay, that's better. And what I want to take away from these 2 kind of historical observations is the fact that architecture practice as we know it today, what is enshrined in our professional practice courses and our NCARB exams as how things are done, are relatively new innovations and therefore themselves potentially subject to change. The last scale that I've been thinking about the intersection of equity and professional practice is in my own practice. I founded Future Firm 6 years ago with my partner Craig Reschke. We are now a practice of 6 based on the south side of Chicago. And questions about professional practice and equity start to land really squarely in kind of mundane issues like general contractor procurement processes. How do you, for example, really ensure that the hard cost of construction goes towards wealth building in the communities in which you work, as well as in the more kind of abstract questions of design? So some of the more theoretical or historical questions about the intersection of professional practice and equity, I think for me, are tested against the urgency of day-to-day budgets, deadlines, and city politics on behalf of my clients. As Igor mentioned, I'll also talk about this too, all of whom are folks trying to make change in their own industries and communities. These are all pictures of Craig because I am the person who takes pictures on job sites and not of him. Design research projects, one of which I'm going to start with, I think allow me to explore these broader concerns that I observe in my day-to-day work, but can't be addressed necessarily through individual client fee-based projects. Instead, we try to use design research to verify, complicate, and explore solutions to what can feel like entrenched problems in the way that architecture does or doesn't serve. So this first project I want to share with you, called Violation City, is a speculation about the present. This project starts with a polemic. All of Chicago's buildings are illegal. Since 2006, the Chicago's Department of Buildings inspectors have issued over 1.1 million building violations and counting. These citations are used by the city to regulate and enforce the building code, and they're pervasive, exceeding in number even the total number of individual buildings in the city overall. Violations are issued in every neighborhood and in every census tract, and these violations are used to describe a myriad of building types, from garages to churches to tall towers, including structures of seemingly all ages and styles. Inspectors use violations to document their evaluation of a building's non-compliance with city ordinances, which range from trivial infractions, such as piled up refuse in the side yard, violation code number 138056, to major structural damage in foundations, code number 069014, or exterior walls, code 61014. In the eyes of the Chicago building inspectors, of whom this is one, all of Chicago's buildings are in a process of a continuous, slow emergence into violation, from the splintering of a windowsill after rain to the slow movement of a foundation over decades, slipping out of alignment. In 2019, the Conservation Bureau of the Department of Buildings, responsible for existing buildings, undertook 22,273 individual complaint-triggered inspections. Citywide, the majority of these inspections resulted in building violations. In some neighborhoods, as few as 2% of buildings were inspected without finding faults. So what if, I want to ask, when walking the streets of Chicago, one only saw the violations, the errors, and the flaws? What if the totality of the brick wall was obscured in favor of the slowly growing cracks? What if you never saw the person in the window, but only the window's uneven frame? What if every city block was not composed of the totality of these conditions, but instead only the broken porch members, the accounted for smoke, and the crumbling masonry? What opportunities would we see, and what stories would we miss? So this project, Violation City, revisits Italo Calvino's 1972 novel, Invisible Cities, through the lens of Chicago's building violations. I think probably like many of you, as a student, I was very inspired by this book. And then over my career, I've also been inspired by Calvino's personal politics as well. So in Invisible Cities, Marco Polo visits with a weary Kublai Khan, and he tells the Khan of 55 seemingly magical cities from his travels: a city of 1,000 deep wells, a city without thresholds, a city of eternal markets, a city comprised of only water pipes. Of course, they in the end are all Venice. But Marco Polo teaches us the city is not just one monolithic thing. Instead, it is a desert of labile and interchangeable data. It is a collection of signs to be deciphered. Violation City appropriates this technique to render visible the simultaneous impact and banality of building violations and the institutions which produce them. So in 4 drawings, Violation City uses an act of fictional subtraction to highlight the 20 most frequently issued building violations since 2006. Buildings are drawn through the eyes of Chicago's building inspectors, reducing everything to a form of observational assessment. Each one of these houses collages together a group of misdeeds or failed maintenance that together describe an unspoken form of collective risk. Welcome to the Violation City. This is the house of egress. This house carries the memories of the Great Chicago Fire. It is a house of smoke and warnings. It is defined by constant need for multiple ways out. It is tangled by obstacles and obstructions. Its bones reverberate with the harmonic rhythm of well-placed alarms. This is the house of Enclosure. It is a house of exteriors. It has no interior. It is made of all the stories that can be captured by a single wall, the refuse left by framers between wall studs, the history of the Chicago common brick, the weeping of the weep holes in the masonry. It is the leak and the crack in the joint left untuck-pointed. This is the house of openings. This is the house of the ways in and the ways out. Inside, one can always hear the doors slamming shut, the windows creaking open, and the hail on the skylight. It is the opening which lets in the breeze, the friend, the stranger, and the unintentional gust of cold air. This is the house of compliance. It is a house of regulations and a house of rule breakers. It is formed by marks on paper, notarized forms, and Project Docs 9.1.8.5. Its enclosure is built around ongoing arguments with administrative courts, with city legal counsel and zoning attorneys, and its archives are both infinite and always missing. But despite the ubiquity of building violations in Chicago, their impact on communities is very uneven. Far from being monolithic in their judgments, the prosecutorial actions of the Department of Buildings index and reproduce the city's complexities. Of course, Chicago's regulation of new construction maintains public health accessibility and sound building practices, but it's worth noting that building violations are more frequently issued in the city's African American and Latinx communities than anywhere else. This is a history probably many of you know, but in Chicago specifically, in the 1950s and 60s, speculators took advantage of African Americans who dreamed of owning property, but were unable to secure the same federally backed loans because of redlining that white home buyers were able to acquire. So real estate speculators sold houses to black families at double and triple their market value on contract, flipping a $3,000 home into a $12,000 sale. But part of the issue with this is that contract sellers remained the owners. They held the deeds on the condition that the buyers paid large monthly mortgage payments on time with higher than market interest rates. With even one missed payment, the owner had the right to evict the buyer, resulting in the loss of the entire investment, and then restart the process with another family on the same property, earning the same profit on the same house again and again. Historian Beryl Satter writes that while contract sellers were robbing Chicago's black population of estimated $1 million a day, black owners found themselves in untenable situations trying to make their payments. Many families took on multiple jobs, and they also kind of subdivided their apartments in order to try to make up payments and rent. Of course, in the late 1960s, the Contract Buyers League, which was a group of African-American homeowners organized out of the West Side, out of North Lawndale, where I now do work, comprising both buyers from across the city, organized door-to-door activism to render visible the schemes of contract buyers. They eventually litigated their case all the way to the Supreme Court, which in two landmark cases ensured that, quote, a dollar in the hands of a black man might have the same purchasing power as a dollar in the hands of a white man. Nonetheless, discriminatory lending and mortgage practices continue even beyond federal regulation. So I think you can see from this map that if we overlay a map of the building violation hotspots in Chicago, we see where they align with the South and West Side neighborhoods. These are places that are carrying a multi-generational burden of redlining, a practice which of course deprived African American communities of inherited wealth through the mechanisms of property ownership, home equity, and affordable housing. Beyond the discretionary actions of building inspectors, these historic and ongoing forms of discriminatory lending have prevented owners from undertaking needed maintenance and repair, ultimately producing and compounding maintenance issues. So just to decipher this map for you, the hatch that is underneath the map shows the grades A, B, D, C, and D from the HOLC redlining maps, and then the scale of the dots above are the kind of rates of the quantities of building violations since 2006. And building violations have really high stakes. If they accumulate unaddressed for whatever reason, building owners can find themselves in the Building Hearings Division, what is colloquially called building court. In building court, the city prosecutes the owners of buildings deemed as having hazardous violations through both receivership and forfeiture. So the city of Chicago has the power to acquire a building in question for purchase by a third party, or if no buyer can be found, which often happens, and the violations are deemed hazardous, slate the building for demolition, fast-track demolition, or city-ordained demolition, which has decimated the South and West Side's building stock. So I think many people know about Chicago's issue with vacancy. On this map, you can see the kind of heat map in plan is the city-owned vacant lots, and then the vertical spikes are city-ordained demolitions, which occur after unaddressed building violations. The city of Chicago right now owns 19,000 vacant lots, though it adds to this list every year, and I don't always update this number. It has continued to order city-owned or city-ordained demolitions, over 3,100 since 2008. What is the role of architects in the ongoing push and pull between regulation and compliance? An endless war between crumbling parapets and missing smoke detectors, with the city's residents caught in the middle? Building violations work is unglamorous for architects, ungainly in execution, requiring bureaucratic paperwork, and rarely producing magazine-worthy photography, and is often poorly paid. However, the fifth most issued building violation since 2006, with over 16,000 occurrences, is to submit plans prepared, signed, and sealed by a licensed architect or registered structural engineer to obtain for approval and obtain permit. So building issues which require an architect's seal to resolve often comprise the most serious infractions. Yet despite the pervasive need for design services in Chicago, registered architects and design firms capable of solving building violations are located exactly in the areas where building violations are least common, like a bizarre inverted image. So this map, the small dots locate registered architects. Some registered architects submit their home address, some submit their firm address, so there's some irregularity there. The larger dots are registered design firms, which is a registration required in Illinois to practice architecture. And the heat map underneath shows building violations. So you can see that we are located exactly where we are least needed. So I want to ask through this project, if our obligation is to uphold and adhere to the building code taught in professional practice, evaluated in licensure exams. This is often described through the framework of new construction, but what about the ongoing projects of maintenance and the difficult acts of care which comprise the ongoing work of maintaining a city's collective building stock? How do we reframe violations from acts of criminality enforced by fines and court actions to a collective responsibility for the city's residents at large, as well as a potential avenue for design expertise? So I'm going to share a few projects which I think intervene in this landscape now that you understand a little bit about Chicago and how I see the city. The first one is a policy proposal which looks at a very specific kind of illegal building, which we call the Rebel Garage. So when my partner and I, the left image is about architecture, the image on the right is just a gratuitous puppy picture for you all to enjoy. When my partner and I started practice, we got an 8-week-old puppy who you see here. These are two things I can confidently say no human should ever do at the same time. We signed up for dog training classes, and it ended up they were held in a garage and an adjacent alley. So it was parking by day and puppy classes by night. That arrow points at my dog, who was very shy in the beginning. But while we were taking these classes, we began to notice that many Chicagoans do things in their garages other than park. They cook, they paint, they weld, they run businesses, they fix cars and bikes, they house families, friends, and guests, they operate CSAs, and they play music, and they host exhibitions. But what we also noticed is that many of these garages are illegal. Owners have adapted them in various ways that don't comply with building code. They were running businesses that weren't licensed by the municipal code or allowed by the zoning code. Nonetheless, many of them seemed to be thriving and seemed, in the most part, to be embraced by their neighbors. So while looking at garages, we also started looking at the history of alleys, which have always kind of shared as a connective tissue between garages. The city's first alleys were laid out in the 19th century, and they were intended to be spaces of infrastructure for the kind of unsightly things that have to happen in a city. Garbage collection and garbage burners, who you see here, coal delivery, human and horse waste storage, and so on. But it's worth noting that I think even in this moment in the 19th century, folks who were doing kind of tenement activism also noted that alleys were a space of play for children because they had light and ventilation when the adjacent crowded buildings do not. And so as part of Rebel Garages, we started to ask, what is a future for alleys that might reflect the current needs of a city or create spaces for new ways of living together? This is an annual event in Ravenswood Manor, a Ravenswood Manor garage sale, where everybody opens up their garage at the same time, and people sell hot dogs and lemonade, and they have garage sales, and all the alleys and buildings are activated here at the same time. So this seems like something to us that's already happening in the city. And so in this research, we started interviewing a series of who we called garage rebels, 9 garage rebels in total, who had transformed or used their garage for something other than parking. We found these people through word of mouth, through posting on Everyblock and with Craigslist. And you'll see that we developed a kind of garage witness protection program because people were worried that when we published this research, the Department of Buildings inspectors would come and issue violations on their buildings. So we created this way of drawing that kind of obscured the context of their garages while highlighting the kind of amazing adaptations they had made on the interior. This is a couple who built a second floor, which they described as storage, and then after the garage was inspected, they had their general contractor put in a stair and turned it into an office for the retired husband. Here, this is a illegally operating car repair service in the neighborhood of Pilsen, which is operated by a father and son. So we ended up coming up with 9 policy proposals that intervened in Chicago's building, municipal, and zoning codes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll share a few of them with you here today. And I think that what's important about these policy proposals is that they were intended to reflect what is actually already occurring in Chicago's alleys and garages and trying to facilitate new ways for these to be legal and safe. So one idea is that there could be a kind of rubble block zoning overlay. One of the things that we found when we were looking at garages is in some blocks, all the neighbors have agreed to open up the fences between their backyards for their kids to play together. So we see that there's already some kind of collective agreement on how folks combine private space into public space in the city. This is what it might look like where some blocks are rebel and some blocks are not. We also looked at the municipal code. Right now, according to the municipal code, this list on the left shows businesses that you are not allowed to operate as home businesses, including in your garage. So while there are some I agree with, I do not think you should probably have a crematorium in your garage. I do think it would be okay if you had a dancing school or a tarot card reading shop. So some of these proposals were intended to just trigger conversation about whether there are elements in the zoning and municipal code which are outdated, on which we as a society collectively maybe now disagree. This was also a revision of the municipal code to allow you to hang your shingle, to design garages to reflect how they're used. Right now, you cannot have dedicated signage, a dedicated person door for a business, or interior shelving and storage and display for goods. And then we were also trying to think about rebel garages in relationship to other existing city policies. So right now, developers profit from transit-oriented development, which reduces parking requirements near public transit in Chicago. However, there's no benefit to residential communities in the same area. So we wanted to suggest that if the city wants to encourage people towards using public transit, perhaps allowing a kind of zoning overlay for people to not park in their garages but do something else might be a worthy component. Our final policy proposal was to let garage architecture shine, to adjust the limits to height and area restrictions for garages. And I think what's captured by this rendering, imagining a world in which these policy proposals have already come about. So in this future, alleys have become vibrant civic and community spaces where multiple uses thrive with the consent of the residents, simultaneously legal, vibrant, and eccentric. Ultimately, our work on this became part of a larger chorus of folks in Chicago, including the Urban Land Institute, who are advocating for ADUs. There's now a pilot program allowing accessory dwelling units in a series of limited neighborhoods. Future Firm just put in permit for one of the first 20 ground-up ADUs in the city of Chicago. But for me, these policy proposals it's important to also see them through an equity lens. When we did interviews with folks across the city of Chicago, it became clear to me that people who were breaking the law on the south and west sides were less eager to speak to us or have their garages documented and published because it was kind of well known that there was an inconsistency in how the building code was enforced and how at risk they felt of discretionary approaches described in Violation City. So I think that what's important for me about rebel garages is that these policy proposals, on one hand, reflect what's already happening in the city, but they allow for this kind of use that we seem to collectively agree on to happen more in a kind of more equitable way in different neighborhoods. I'm going to show a project that is about creating platforms, a kind of curatorial practice that I've been working on for a few years now through this project, Midnight Palace. If Rebel Garages addresses the illegal condition of a certain building typology, the illegal garage, Midnight Palace addresses the idea of a kind of illegal time zone. So my students are reading or have read, Matthew Beaumont writes in his fantastic book, Night Walking, how the common night walker has been criminalized since the 13th century in Europe and the US, identifying those who walk, work, and traverse the city at night as tainted or somehow morally suspect. This was originally enforced through curfews and other kind of policing and criminalization, yet lingers on in a kind of societal sense about who's out and about at night. So as an extension of this history, I've been interested in how public and private spaces and the built environment at night has also been made illegal by design and tradition. So the night is a time when public spaces are closed and leisure considered suspicious and policed. In 2017, we founded the Night Gallery, which is a nocturnal exhibition space in the window of our office. It's open from sunset to sunrise during the summer months, which are the only months you can reasonably be outside in Chicago. And I think what is exciting about it is it moves the gallery from an interior space to the public space of the sidewalk. And it's hosted exhibitions now for going on 5 years. And I think that Night Gallery diverges from Chicago's more established institutional exhibition spaces by contributing to kind of informal programmed public spaces. The attendees always include this kind of diverse mix of architects and students who we know who come to see the work, but then also people who are just going by on the sidewalk at night. So we always get construction workers who are having breakfast on the seating out there early in the morning, or folks going home to and from the bar who end up kind of wound up in this discourse about architecture that I think they might not otherwise have participated in. And then in 2020, we kind of took a Night Gallery on the road. We collaborated with other businesses on the south and west sides, which, like us, are commercial spaces by day, but also community spaces by night. So this is an event that we had at Principal Barber's, which is around the corner from this wall, which is a barbershop by day and a community space by night. And we hosted a newly commissioned work by the artist Avery Young in response to home videos of the riots in Chicago from the late 1960s after the assassination of Dr. King. What was interesting to me about this event was there were people who came by who had been living in that neighborhood for so long that they recognized people and places that were in the live footage that no longer existed, but there were also people in the audience who had never been to the West Side before because of Chicago's issues with segregation. So we decided to kind of extend and expand the Night Gallery project when in 2021 we were commissioned to complete an installation as part of Exhibit Columbus as Irwin and Xenia Miller Prize winners. Columbus in Indiana is this kind of amazing, strange company town. It's the home of the Cummins Corporation. And while we were spending time here, often driving around at night because it was during the pandemic, one thing that we learned was that 39% of people who live in Columbus, Indiana, work in manufacturing compared to only 9% nationwide. So we also kind of understood that within this group of manufacturing workers, there were many second and third shift workers who keep the city's factories turning 24 hours a day. So second and third shift workers who wake up at dusk and go to bed in the morning, who have breakfast at sunset and dinner at sunrise. And we started to think that in addition to the folks who work at Cummins and the other factory workers in the city, there are actually many other residents of what we started calling the Midnight City. So these are 15 million Americans who are night shift workers, who might include an attendee at a 24-hour gas station, a truck driver who is passing through on the highway, a hotel night clerk, a bartender closing out last call, or the parent of a newborn soothing their baby. And this is what my studio is looking at here at Rice this semester, but I think we also started to realize that the civic and amenity spaces of the city only serve the daytime city. So in Columbus, Indiana, none of the Midnight City residents take the Colum bus, which stops at 8 p.m. They don't get to visit Nopelet Park, which is a popular park in the city, which closes at sunset. They don't get to eat at Ramen Alley, Jill's Diner, the Garage Pub and Grill, all popular restaurants. Instead, most of the Midnight City's popular locations are located along the highway and serve truck drivers. These include 24-hour gas stations, restaurants, and stores like Walmart. So this project asked, how do we design for the Midnight City? And what is a public space for the Midnight City's residents? Midnight Palace was inspired in design by the atmospheric qualities of nighttime and designed for the city's night owls. Located at a Cummins building, it features a wall of light that was made from inspired by historic light bulbs from the Columbus streetscape. So the colors of the lights distributed include high-pressure sodium fixtures, contemporary LEDs, reflecting the soffit lighting and tail lighting. We ended up collaborating with this amazing electrical fabrication company. In the beginning, we imagined for them to build all this conduit that they would be like out there with one of the conduit benders, like bending each length of conduit based on our crazy design. So we had come up with this like kind of like 500-page book describing each length of conduit and each bend. And when I was presenting this to them, at some point, Gaylor said to us, like, don't you guys use Revit? And I was like, oh yeah. So we sent them the BIM model and we found out they actually use CNC for all their conduit bending, and that Gaylor is actually a leading fabricator in prefabricated electrical work, which means that the workers who work with them get to work inside like great conditions in the shop, and then this material is shipped out to the site. So if you go there, you can see like they have like 50 feet of conduit attached to like a junction box, which they bring out on a semi-trailer and kind of fit into the space. And they ended up being like incredibly proud of this project and really kind of amazing collaborators with us. Every piece of this design is made from tools. They made this video. Every piece of this design is made of tools and components that a trade electrician knows how to use. So they were able to train apprentice electricians on this project. And for me as an architect, I think sometimes the incredible craft of trade workers is hidden behind drywall. Like all the kind of amazing coordination of plumbing, electrical, and mechanical gets kind of plastered over with drywall in the work, but we were really happy in this project to be able to bring it out. Sorry, I don't know why there's this kind of jumping of the video, but you can see it here. And so this is the completed work as it was shown, or as it was installed in the site. I apologize for the kind of jerkiness of this video. I think that what was important to me, as well as the kind of formal component of this project, is that we extended Night Gallery here. So there were a series of what we called walk-by screens for small gatherings of the Midnight City residents. And then there was this larger screen that faced out onto the street so we could do kind of bigger drive-in style events. We ended up partnering with Yes Cinema, which was a local cinema that supports nonprofit work with at-risk residents of Columbus. And we screened over the course of the run of this exhibition a series of film and video works that explored the idea of the nocturnal city. So we started off on opening night with this French short film called Genius Loci by Adrienne Marigot, which was animated and abstract. It was about demons and magic and risk and beauty. We also showed photography from photographers David Chalil and Jenny Hanasek of the Mississippi Watershed at night. And we're also able to highlight work by other scholars and researchers kind of globally who are looking at the same topic. So J.C. Macri screened a film about immigrant workers in London, Eastern European immigrant workers in London working in the food logistics business. And Cyrus Penarroyo, my colleague at Michigan, showed work about the Filipina nurses who work the front lines of COVID in LA's hospitals as night shift workers. And I think that just to kind of come back to this idea of the legal city, one of the ideas of this project is not that it solves the question of nighttime being kind of rendered illegal by habit and tradition, but instead it argues that there can be beauty and solidarity in the midnight city, spectral lights flickering at dusk, a quietness that makes way for a higher resolution of sound, The Midnight Palace is designed to be a kind of gateway that welcomes residents and visitors alike to the Midnight City. I'm just going to quickly show you some work from the practice as well, so you can get a kind of sense of the breadth of the ways that I'm thinking about these issues. As Igor mentioned, our friend, when introducing us recently, called us architects for change makers. And I like this kind of moniker so much that we've adopted it as our tagline. So the work we do tends to be for small business owners, individuals, and organizations trying to make change in their own communities. These are some projects that are on the boards or recently completed. On the top left, Rexology is an independent Black-owned pharmacy owned by Lena Smith, who's focused on innovative, community-focused healthcare. The idea is that instead of waiting for your prescription next to like cat food and diapers, you can wait for your wait for your prescription in a space that looks like a Warby Parker. So that just opened. These images are hot off the press. On the right, we have actually under construction now. It's in demolition. It's an existing building. It's a new retail space and commercial bakery for Maya Camille Broussard, who runs Justice of the Pies, which is a bakery with a social justice focus. You can watch her in Bake Off, which is an amazing Netflix series, if you want to follow along. And so this is under construction. We're really excited. It's on the south side in a former mid-century dentist's office. On the bottom left, also under construction, is Mr. Ed's. This is a pharmacy in North Lawndale, which when Martin Luther King was organizing out of the West Side, he would stop by Edwin's dad's pharmacy every day to pick up the newspaper. So the intent, Edwin wants to honor his father by creating a pharmacy that's not just a pharmacy, but also a place where you can pick up hot food and home goods and other kind of grocery store items. They're doing great business right now, selling food on the street, and he wants to extend that into the winter months. We also just completed Hem House, which is a single family home in East Garfield Park, which is intended to address a kind of missing middle market of housing. So it doesn't compete with subsidized affordable housing, but it also kind of fills a gap when the next new construction homes in the neighborhood are selling for $600,000 and $700,000. This home, when it went on the market at $399,000, was the fifth least expensive single-family new construction home in the city of Chicago, and it sold in 2 days to 2 public school teachers in the neighborhood. So I just want to concentrate on 2 of these projects that I feel especially excited and proud about. In 2021, we completed the Silver Room, the renovation of a very beloved store in Hyde Park. This aerial photo is taken during the Silver Room's annual block party, which now draws 30,000 people. It started as like a group of people listening to music in the street. This arrow points to the location of the Silver Room. Eric Williams is a client who has now become kind of friend and family. He started the Silver Room in 1997, and it's had 3 locations since then. But this was the first time he worked with a design team to kind of renovate the store. And I think what was interesting about this process was we had a kind of more involved design that was ready to go into construction, but then COVID-19 hit. So for small retailers, especially small businesses, as everyone knows, this was a really challenging time. But we thought this was a good opportunity to renovate the store while the store was closed, so people had something to be excited about. So the design strategy is organized around flexibility, simplicity, and a unifying aesthetic that transform the space into a quiet backdrop for the Silver Room's curated selection of products. So we almost think about this like an exhibition space. All the armatures are kind of painted a monolithic white. The walls are in this kind of 2-tone of gray and white. I can't really tell if you can see on the screen. And then there are these kind of 4 custom retail display units, which are on wheels, which can be wheeled to the side every night when the Silver Room becomes a site for DJ sets, salsa dancing lessons, grown folk story time, community organizing, and so on. We collaborated with friend Norman Teague Design Studios, who is actually the person who coined the term Architects for Changemakers. He built and we collaborated to design all these millwork pieces that are a kind of flexible plug-and-play system that can be used to adjust the display based on the kind of changing products that the Silver Room features. And I think what was really important to Eric was that the team that both designed and executed this store reflected the Silver Room's own community-focused mission and its commitment to businesses of color. So lighting and electricity were done by Gravity, who has worked with Eric since the 90s. Digital fabrication was done by Max Davis, who is also someone who I went to college with. And this was a team that now, as you'll see in the following project, have now come together to try to execute design-focused, design excellence-oriented projects across the South Side. So after the Silver Room opened, Eric and his business partner, Cecilia Cuff, decided to open a restaurant, Bronzeville Winery, on the south side of Chicago. Bronzeville Winery, when it opens, will be, I think, the only kind of sit-down restaurant you can go to a date in this neighborhood. So we are very excited about it, as we also live nearby. Eric and Cecilia came to us with this really incredible, rich palette of references that they were interested in, from Miro to the warehouse where Chicago house music began with Frankie Knuckles, to the Barcelona Pavilion, to Virgil Abloh's take on the Barcelona Pavilion, to Duro Lowoo's kind of incredible, colorful fashion design work, and it kind of challenged us to bring all these references together in a space that was really welcoming, but also flexible. So we came up with a strategy that tried to highlight the restaurant's focus on art, music, and culture. So this will be a wall that features rotating exhibitions, the same way there is in the Silver Room, curated by Eric. There's also going to be this collection of wines that this older lady in Bronzeville had collected with her husband through his whole life. And when she was moving to a senior home, she donated this kind of amazing collection of wine to the restaurant to be exhibited. There's going to be this, I think, amazing chef's table with indoor garden that is going to kind of feature local plants, outdoor seating, a wine wall, especially featuring wines by Black-owned wineries. And I wonder if I can kind of skip forward here. Hold on, if it will let me. Otherwise, you'll have to watch Underground Plumbing, which takes a million years. I think that what is really exciting to me is that the team that came in part together over Silver Room, as well as other collaborators of ours, came back together to execute this project. So again, Norman Teague is designing the custom chairs and tables, which were also recently acquired by the Brooklyn Museum. Rocky Alicea, who's been working with Eric for years, is doing all the custom metal work. The indoor garden is by Omni, which is also a Southside Bronzeville actually based landscape design office. There are custom light fixtures by an artist, Lucy Slavinsky, whose husband is amazing jazz musician, Kahil El-Zabar, who will open the restaurant when it begins. And her light fixtures are made from the salvaged steel pieces from factories in Chicago. The bricks were donated by the Astorgate Studio from a demolished church, St. Lawrence Church. And Eric ultimately commissioned new work by artist Krista Franklin to decorate the walls at the restaurant. This is probably seems like a little bit too jerky, but I kind of hoping that this will take us to the soft opening where when 75% done with construction, Eric and Cecilia hosted an event with the Chicago Bulls to celebrate the emergence of this restaurant. Let's give this one more minute. It's funny, I can't tell if this construction seems like it went faster or slower in the video than watching it in real life. Here. Give you guys another minute to watch this. Here's the work by Krista Franklin coming in and Norm and his team executing the millwork. Okay, in the interest of the time, I will save this, but I'm excited to welcome you guys in person when I think this space will be shown off to its best quality and where the cocktails will literally be on fire. So to conclude this talk, I want to come back to the question of Violation City and finish with one final speculative design research project around our role as architects in our agency. So in this project, Office of the Public Architect, we started with a simple question. If you are accused of a crime and you cannot afford a lawyer, you are entitled to a public defender. When issued a building violation, if you cannot afford an architect, should you also have the right to a public architect? This is the map you remember from the beginning of the lecture of architects located exactly where we are, in fact, not needed. And I wanted to kind of think about the idea of an Office of the Public Architect that was funded in the same ways as the building inspectors that could be located in former post office windows across the city. I think this is kind of an interesting idea that newly minted architects could gain on-the-ground experience while senior designers could track and flag broader concerns on a civic scale. And we were inspired by Clara Foltz, who was the first woman who was admitted to the bar in California as a lawyer in the 19th century, who fought for the idea of a public defender. When she first called for the public defender's office, the New York Times called it absurd and actually called it the absurd project of a lady lawyer. Of course, the Public Defender's Office, though underfunded, is now a kind of staple of how we think about the legal system, though it wasn't kind of brought into law federally until 70 years after Clara Foltz first called for it. But she has this statement, the law should be a shield as well as a sword, and I believe this also to be true of the Department of Buildings. So I'm going to do like story time here now for a second, where I'm going to read you a short fiction imagining ourselves in a future where this office exists. So imagine yourself in a near or distant future when the Office of the Public Architect is funded and appointed in the same way as the city's building inspectors. Stop, correct that. Both are well funded and both are thriving. But the Office of the Public Architect is a center for all things civic in the built environment. As a model of practice, it skips over the well-worn tropes of the 21st century sole practitioner who minimizes overhead and fulfills your code requirement with necessary speed and leanness. Instead, it leverages scale and the tactics of socially engaged and activist practices. It becomes a network, a hive, a horizontal coalition, an office in the public interest. Consider meeting with a public architect. They help you resolve your building violations. Some are easy, some are still a pain. You sit adjacent to one another at a large table with pens and drawings. If you've been issued many building violations, they help you to create a plan to address them over time in accordance with your budget. They don't require you, as they did in 2022, to address them all at once. You collaborate to do a form of triage. The lights are warm and they glow. In the waiting room, you meet some of your neighbors. You chat about your week. Some of them attended events at the Office of the Public Architect a few days before. They met with general contractors, material representatives, tradesmen, all of whom have been vetted by the city. Someone found a plumber who seems okay. They give you the plumber's business card. There's a schedule on the wall that seems almost overfull. Workshops on design and construction, lectures and events organized by local groups, an opportunity to sign out the space for a program of your own devising. Maybe you find out that some of your repairs can be addressed through an easy permit without an architect's stamp. You get help pulling the application and make plans to start work. You pull additional information on other permits for the built environment available from the Department of Transportation, for example, which can issue a permit for a sidewalk, cafe, planter boxes, or signage hanging over the road. A large digital map floats above you, glowing a rich blue for Lake Michigan. Little LED lights flicker on and off, showing the resolution of building violations and the issuance of new ones. Red circles blink slowly over buildings owned by the city's problem building owners. A weather forecast radar washes over the screen, producing signals of sites for possible storm sewer overflow. Small peaks indicate aldermanic contributions to ward infrastructure spending. What happens behind the desk? Architects buzz about, they argue with each other. A junior architect has forgotten to reference the most updated stock detail for parapet repair, which was revised last month to adhere to the most efficient masonry methods. Other young designers, many recent grads, join the ranks of the public architect for ground level experience, the desire to serve, or simply the reputation of the office for quickly producing licensed architects. Remind her of the update and send around a meme about bricks on the group chat. Everybody cackles. One senior architect puts on their coat to head to building court to testify about a predatory landlord and a porch collapse. The back of house looks like a chaotic mess with some kind of underlying organization only known to those who work there. Maps, data analysis, material samples, mock-ups, flyers, tax records. The architects always expect to work at the scale of the city. Their guidelines on installation, for example, give them leverage with the insulation manufacturers. The impacts in energy use were visible across the city in just 1 year. They work with the city's departments, keeping conversations open with water management, transportation, the Office of People with Disabilities. They open partnerships with activists, schools, and community groups. Later in the day, a big developer who wants to build on a series of vacant lots in your neighborhood will present their plans at a forum at the office. A public architect will moderate. You plan to attend. The alderman seeks feedback. Dinner from the neighborhood pizza place you hear will be served. Before closing up for the day, an architect checks the big countdown clock that notes how many violations are currently active. After a long period of battling down the backlog of hundreds of thousands, these days they watch it flicker up and down in the low hundreds. When the clock reaches zero, which happens a few days every year, an annoyingly loud buzzer goes off and everybody celebrates. Thank you.
Before opening the conversation with the audience, I was thinking during your presentation that somehow your practice is also showing a change of paradigm somehow in the way we think about our profession, our discipline, and how we project it into the future. Actually, your firm, the name of your firm, Future Firm, is kind of expressing this kind of willing to project your practice into the future. And I was thinking, it came to my mind a very influential office, Future System, that has also this idea of the future in a very completely different context and moment. How it has also a similar kind of will of changing, transforming, and looking into the future. In their cases, looking to construction methods and processes and materials, in which the protagonist and technology is the kind of main protagonist. What is very interesting in your work is actually that the building is not so much the protagonist, and actually it's very nice how you show many people, you explain the lives of people, the inhabitants, you give the protagonism to them. And I was wondering if this paradigmatic shift, you see that the technology is also playing a kind of different role in Future System. For example, they were founded under the umbrella of Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, with this kind of optimism in the kind of construction of the materials available. And this. How do you see this kind of shift in our generation, and how you see also the role of technology and the role of the building and the architect as a protagonist in our discipline?
Yeah, so a thought about the name of the practice, which is that for me, I think Future Firm is a kind of good dialectic between two things. Like on one hand, things that are future oriented, that are kind of sci-fi, that are speculative, that are about kind of big transformations over time. But firm is all the things that architecture does that is building tech related, that we kind of deliver buildings that are structurally sound, that don't leak, that are on time and on budget. And I think the practice has always been a tension between those two. I think there could have been a different road for us where we were only speculative, right? We weren't grounded in the kind of, I guess I would say, material practices of day to day, or vice versa. We could be, I think, a firm that does like pretty good project delivery and doesn't care at all about the future. But I think that there's a tension between those two things that is really important, that helps the kind of conversation in our practice and with the people we work with. I think that like some of the research that I did around corporate practice in the 20th century showed that there were always these kind of like weird side projects, even at the firms where you would least expect them to happen. So like SOM at one point was like doing collaborations with manufacturing companies that were like kind of also speculative. Like they did this house called 194X that was about like kind of prefabricated housing in the post-war period, right? But they also kind of led computation and building computation, like early drafting and so on. And so for me, I think like, I guess I'm not so sure that these things come in kind of like clear paradigm shifts, but actually that there are cycles about thinking about the future of practice that kind of come in and out. I think for me, like I'm kind of people-oriented, just myself, and so I think our clients and collaborators tend to be the protagonists of our stories. But I think there are many ways to work on equity that are actually kind of like technology and building tech focused. And it's kind of most clear to me actually with our clients that nobody comes to work with us because they think like we're social justice oriented. Like they come to us because we have now a reputation for delivering projects that work. And I think that that's really important to me also as a pedagogue. And sorry, this is like kind of taking another course, but like that if you can't detail an exterior wall, if you can't kind of spec installation, like we have no business kind of showing up in underserved communities at all. So I think there always has to be this tie between future and firm, between kind of building technology and kind of social practice and collaborators and the other ways we think about architecture. I don't think we can really kind of see this as like one way versus the next, but rather like two things that are kind of continuously intertwined.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Nathan.
No, first of all, the work is really impressive, and it's so nice to see it presented, at least from my perspective, this formal way, because I've been familiar with the work, but this is special. And I'd like to follow up on something I wanted to say, touched on, which is really about authorship.
Yeah.
And I think that it's something that connects the entire presentation today, from basically recognizing Norman Teague as the one who gave you a framing for the firm,
Yeah.
for Rebel Garage as being some about conditions that were already there, but you're expressing it, to also your connection, research, and collaboration, and teaching, curation, there's all there. So I'm curious to know how you frame authorship within the firm, and also how maybe you see that connecting to like a larger moment in terms of architecture practice today.
Yeah, I think you also probably know that I'm currently working on editing guest editing an issue of Log about co-authoring with Anna Miliaki. And I think that one of the things that we've been thinking about that journal is that actually it's singular authorship that's the myth, not co-authorship that's the new paradigm, right? That actually all along architecture is always co-authored for better or for worse. Like there's always builders, tradesmen, and so on, but there's also like different ways that architects themselves think about kind of authoring, like co-authoring with a site, with as-built drawings, with buildings that already exist, with communities and so on. And like I don't really believe in my kind of the way I see the world that there's any project that isn't already co-authored, and it doesn't all have to be like kumbaya as a political project. It just means that like buildings are things that require intense capital and material and like many people to assemble and put together. And I actually think it is like a 20th century thing that we get this myth of the singular genius architect that like emerges out of some like very coordinated marketing campaigns, at the mid-century, that is like a weird myth that for some reason we as a discipline chose to like, and is like actually not very true. And it doesn't mean that I don't think, and I'm also thinking about here like as a pedagogue, it doesn't mean like we don't have to kind of rely on ourselves as problem solvers or thinkers or people to kind of advocate or fight for a project as individuals. But I kind of think like the base condition is actually co-authoring and has always been, and it is authorship, which was the weird singular heroic authorship, which is the blip that will come and go. Yeah, Albert.
Thanks. This is great and very timely observations. I guess my question has to do with how you define your study area.
Yeah.
All of your maps were in the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
And at this point, the city of Chicago proper is about 25% of the population. 75% live outside. Chicago is actually less dense than Houston.
Yeah.
And I guess all of the stuff that's outside of the city is, of course, codependent.
Yeah.
Right, and cul-de-sac. And I guess I'm wondering how you see the work going forward, where you've got a greater population, let's say 75%, who don't have a street to walk on.
Yeah.
Or who don't have an alley
Yeah.
and a garage.
Yeah.
And if we look at a city that's moving a little bit more quickly than Chicago, let's say Brooklyn, where the gentrification has gone on and pushed people of color and low-income people out of the more traditional parts of the city, how do we expand our responsibility to that? And how does your framing, how does your study area, the area that you're choosing to study, address, I guess, another
scale
level
up,
of the future, where we can actually predict what's going to happen as gentrification occurs in the core, and the first-ring suburbs start to suffer?
Yeah, Chicago is a very different condition than Brooklyn, so conversations around gentrification, particularly on the south and west sides in Chicago, are mostly around, like, folks in community have concerns that development will happen in a way that isn't producing wealth for the people who already live there. But Chicago's biggest issue is vacancy, not, kind of density and the displacement that comes from density. So, like, I think as the research shows, that a lot of the reasons that people are leaving Chicago, and this comes from just like my lived experience too, as somebody who lives and works on the South Side, is that people feel like they're leaving the South and West Sides because they don't have the amenities they need, and those neighborhoods have been underserved and under-resourced for so long. Like, I think a lot of these neighborhoods, like, you can't, walk to a grocery store. They're kind of categorized as food deserts. They don't have many of the kind of resources people need. But this is like because of a history of discriminatory practices and racism. And so I think for me in my work, I'm interested in trying to support folks on the south and west sides that are trying to make those neighborhoods into like really awesome places to live. Like, there are going to be places that have restaurants like Bronzo Winery or, stores like Silver Room, which are going to be like really great and are going to be a destination. So I think for me, and these are also neighborhoods that have really kind of historic and personal value to many Chicagoans. Like, for example, we do work on the west side, and many folks in North Lawndale, like, their families have lived there for generations in graystones that people don't want to leave, and they want to maintain, and they want to own, and they want to be able to pass down to their descendants. So my work, I would say, I do not subscribe to the belief that we all have to end up in the suburbs, but rather there can be a way to redevelop underserved neighborhoods in a way that is wealth building for the people who live there, but also just like awesome for Chicago as a whole, that makes Chicago a kind of international city and destination, rather than saying that we kind of give up on those neighborhoods and vacancy is just what we have to live with because it's the status quo.
Would your idea of the future sort of suggest that the suburbs are abandoned and the 75% moves into the city? In the communities that I work in, there's hope that like multiple forms of development are happening at the same time. So housing is happening, but also amenities, but also jobs, right? So I think that for me, I would be in support of kind of any city policies or practices that result in the city of Chicago itself actually wanting to be a place to live, so that we stop seeing a kind of decrease in population and instead an increase again in the places where people want to be. I don't think this is true for everyone, but a lot of the people who we live and work with seem to like to live in the city because it lets them be close to places like theaters, movies, restaurants, bars, all the kind of cultural components that actually make up the work that we do and find is important. I feel I have kept people really into studio, but yeah, Brittany.
Thanks so much for your
of course.
I really just love seeing how the research unfolds and sort of both like on the ground projects as well as these more sort of speculative missions. And I wanted to ask maybe more about how you sort of leverage sci-fi, how you leverage fantasy as a kind of as these sort of methods of fiction in your work, because it's so interesting that, I mean, the aesthetics have this sort of sci-fi, like this midnight glitter, right, the neuromancer, right? But at the same time, a lot of this sort of the future is almost like reveling, taking pleasure in bureaucracy and the work in the kind of the anonymous kind of collective project that is the city, right?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you use SF in your work.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. I am a science fiction and fantasy nerd going back a long time, so I'm glad to see that the influence is registering. I think it's two things. One, a lot of things, like the Office of the Public Architect is actually aesthetically a really boring project. Like, it's a project that is actually about funding. Like, I believe that there should be an equal budget allocated to this office as there is to the Department of, like the building inspector's office. And I think that graphics is one thing that like architects or visualization, whether it's through fiction, whether it's through imagery, is something that designers can do to make a project compelling and interesting, right? I think that, for example, this fiction is something that people feel like they understand immediately, that I don't actually have to tell them the kind of longer histories or the complexities of funding or all the kind of like barriers in the way. They just immediately kind of recognize, oh, it's possible that instead of the Department of Buildings being this like Kafkaesque nightmare, which treats me with any respect, in fact, this could be like this amazing place if we all just decide we want it to be. And for me, that's kind of like the abolitionist project that's embedded actually in all science fiction. And so I guess like to that end as well, I think I'm inspired by science fiction writers who have a political project. Like I'm thinking particularly of Samuel Delany, who argued that like we have to have images of tomorrow in order to make it come about. And I think that that's something that as designers we can be like uniquely suited to doing if those images come with like a kind of grounded sense of the world.
Can I have a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
My first job was in the office of the government architect.
Oh, cool. Are you a Brit?
I'm not that, I am. Sorry.
No, keep going.
So I guess it's a few-part question. So I would say, I don't see it as so far.
I know, it shouldn't be.
And so I wonder to what degree that sci-fi approach to it actually makes it unattainable.
Yes,
when in
that's a good
fact,
question.
it actually exists.
Yeah.
It's not. It's a concrete reality.
Yes. Yes.
And that's one part of the question. And I guess the other part of the question is, would you conceive of the possibility again of a government architect? I mean, all of the land that you're talking about, you said most of it is owned.
It's city-owned land. A lot of vacant land is city-owned land or county-owned land. Yep.
And so I guess it's a question that goes to the approach to deal with Austin and with why take that approach and a kind of why not just go to the city and say let's do this and let's get some funding for this and let's start building housing.
Yeah. This is me going to the city and saying, let's do this. No, I guess I'll say first, thank you for your question, because it's like, it's very optimistic, and I appreciate that. And the sense that this is not a science fiction project is a beautiful one, and one that I'm with you, that with a little bit of will, this could happen tomorrow. I'm not asking for flying buildings, you know? But I think the reality of the kind of political landscape in the US, and particularly in Chicago, which is progressive in its own way and yet faces many kind of entrenched problems in another way, makes it feel like science fiction. And my day-to-day experience of the city and its operations make this feel like it's very far off. On the other hand, I think science fiction brings like a possible world very close, and that this seems possible to you and realistic in the United States context makes me hopeful, because I do believe it is. The Office of the Public Defender was something that seemed impossible until it was real. I don't know, I guess maybe like if Frederick Jameson says like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, it's easier for me to imagine the end of the world than the end of the Department of Buildings. But I think that I am glad that you feel excited about this. I guess I'd say personally, like in a very kind of gray area, like we do a lot of this work. So like Hem House is a project that's on Cook County land. We're pre-qualified architects with the city. The Neighborhood Opportunity Fund projects are a lot of our small commercial clients are funded in part by city grants. So we have this kind of like proxy behavior as Office of the Public Architect but like I'm still very much in private practice with all the kind of burdens and issues that face private practice that are different than a publicly funded office. And so I don't think we should compare, like, for me, what a private architect does, like with a certain kind of orientation towards equity in the city, towards something that would be like really taxpayer funded and invested in with a kind of collective will. So thank you guys. I feel like you have to go to studio.